Erie, Pennsylvania, August 28, 2003. A humid afternoon descended slowly over the small city as a middle aged man sat on the pavement, his breath short, a metal device locked tightly around his neck. His name was Brian Wells, 46 years old, a pizza delivery driver. On any other day, he would have simply returned home with empty pizza boxes and light-hearted stories from customers. But that day, a deadly device, a series of meticulous instructions, and a bank robbery scenario would plunge him into a story that to this day remains almost impossible to believe. It all began at 1:30 in the afternoon. The phone at Mamma Mia's pizzeria rang again with a simple order: two pizzas. What was strange wasn't the order itself, but the delivery address, a television transmission tower on the outskirts of Erie, a quiet location embraced by trees. Brian, known as a quiet man who rarely troubled anyone, calmly took the order and drove his car down the deserted streets. He arrived at the tower area, a place that should have had no need for pizza. It was from that point that his life veered sharply off the rails. The details of those moments around the tower have never been entirely clear, but one fact is undeniable. A collar-shaped device, cold and heavy, was locked around his neck. In his hands, he received several pages of handwritten instructions. The command was clear and left no choice: go to the nearest PNC bank, demand a large sum of money, and then follow a scavenger hunt, a route that promised to lead him to the keys and codes to release the device from his neck. The words pressed in from all directions: obey or die, be too slow, you die, one wrong move, the same result. Brian returned to his car, no longer just a pizza delivery man, but a hostage guided by a map to safety that might not even be real. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, Brian walked into the PNC Bank at Summit Town Center. He carried a shotgun disguised as a walking cane. He also carried a note with his orders: $250,000, 15 minutes, don't try anything foolish, someone is watching. Around his neck, the threat pulsed silently. The terrified teller followed procedure. The bank couldn't access that much cash in such a short time. All they could gather was $8,702, a figure that, to anyone, was nowhere near the amount demanded on the paper. Brian took it and walked out. For someone racing against time with a device around his neck, that amount wasn't a victory, just a ticket to the next step. The air outside was hotter and more real. Brian walked toward his car, carrying the money, the instruction sheets, and what was left of his belief that the scavenger hunt would lead him to safety. But not long after he left the bank, an emergency call was made. The police moved quickly. They found Brian standing near his car in the parking lot of an eyeglass store not far away. In a haze of fear, he tried to explain. Someone else had forced him. There was a scavenger hunt he had to follow. There were keys and a combination that could release the device as long as he was on time. The police called the bomb squad. Safety protocols forced them to keep their distance, to restrain the instinct to get closer, because one rash decision could escalate the disaster. News cameras had already arrived as those minutes stretched out cruelly. Brian sat on the asphalt, waiting for something that was coming too slowly, yet was arriving too fast to outrun. He begged for the device to be removed. He said his time was almost up. In his car, the instruction sheets served as proof that he wasn't making it all up. At the same time, time, the quietest enemy, marched on without compromise. At approximately 3:18 in the afternoon, 30 minutes after the robbery and just a few minutes before the bomb squad reached the scene, the device around Brian's neck exploded. In a few seconds, the crowd froze, voices overlapped in a cacophony, and then a prolonged silence. Brian Wells died at the scene. that afternoon, a life was extinguished, and it was precisely at that moment that a long series of questions had only just begun. After the explosion, investigators searched Brian's car. There, they found the handwritten instruction sheets addressed to the bomb hostage. The sentences dictated a sequence of actions: rob the bank, move to a specific point, retrieve a clue, find the key and code, and then release the device. Brian hadn't been lying. He had even retrieved the first clue amidst the chaos between leaving the bank and stopping in the parking lot. But when police traced the route to the next clue, they found something that shook them. One of the clues had been taken from its spot, deliberately removed by someone unknown. If this game was truly designed to save a compliant hostage, why would another hand remove one of the steps? That same night, federal agents searched Brian's home on Loveland Avenue. There were no signs of bomb making. The evidence seemed to confirm that he was not the one who built the device. 3 days after the incident, Robert Pinetti, a co-worker of Brian's, died of what was ruled an accidental overdose. A few days later, investigators followed up on Brian's initial claim about 4 black men by searching an apartment. No charges were filed. The claim turned out to be false. Was it a lie forced upon Brian by his captors, or his own last-ditch effort to divert danger in his most desperate moments? We will never know for sure. From the thickening fog, one name rose to the surface: William A. Rothstein, the ex-fiancé of a woman named Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong. On September 13th, Rothstein was caught dumping over 1,000 pounds of debris at a landfill. 7 days later, he called 911 to report something far beyond debris. The body of James Roden, Marjorie's boyfriend, was stored in a freezer in his garage. He blamed Marjorie for the murder. The next day, Marjorie was arrested. A few days later, Rothstein was questioned about the last phone call Brian received on the day of the incident. He said he might have used the payphone from which the call was made. The word "might" was left hanging like a slightly ajar door, enough to guess but not enough to conclude. The following year, Marjorie, who had a history of bipolar disorder, was transferred for a long-term psychiatric evaluation, limiting investigators' access to her. At the end of July 2004, Rothstein died of cancer, taking with him answers that might have been needed to piece this story together. A few months later, in early 2005, Marjorie pleaded guilty but mentally ill to the third-degree murder of Roden. She was sentenced to 7 to 20 years in prison. But the Wells case was still far from over. In mid-July, Floyd A. Stockton Jr., Rothstein's roommate, stated that Rothstein and Marjorie were involved in the robbery and bomb plot due to financial pressure. In August and September, Kenneth E. Barnes, Marjorie's fishing buddy, said that before the incident, Marjorie had asked him to kill her own father so his inheritance wouldn't be wasted. In subsequent meetings in December, Barnes added a chilling detail. The day before the incident, August 27, 2003, there was a meeting attended by himself, Marjorie, Rothstein, Stockton, and Brian to review the plan. On the day of the incident, he admitted to having watched Brian through binoculars. Early the next year, investigators tested the consistency of the stories. When Barnes's statement was presented to Marjorie in February, she became angry and denied ever being with Barnes on those dates, even accusing Rothstein of setting her up. 2 days later, when Marjorie's denial was relayed to Barnes, Barnes called her a liar. Barnes's house was searched in March and May for bomb components and other possibly related items. That same May, the 8th and final interview with Marjorie was held. With her lawyer, she led investigators along the route she claimed to have taken on the day Brian died, as if the map in her head could keep the narrative from falling apart. 2 years after the explosion, the grand jury's term was nearing its end. On July 9th, 2007, federal indictments were handed down against Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong and Kenneth Barnes for armed bank robbery, conspiracy, and use of a destructive device in a crime of violence. Brian Wells and William Rothstein were named as unindicted co-conspirators. Brian for his alleged limited involvement in the initial planning, Rothstein because he was deceased. 2 days later, the indictment was unsealed. Floyd Stockton was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. The legal process moved forward. In late July 2008, a judge declared Marjorie not competent to stand trial and ordered further evaluation. In early September, Barnes pleaded guilty to conspiracy and use of a destructive device, and in December he was sentenced to 45 years in prison, also agreeing to testify against Marjorie. A year later, on September 8, 2009, the court declared Marjorie competent to stand trial. In 2010, a cancerous lump was removed from her neck, and she was then diagnosed with glandular cancer that had originated in her breast. A doctor's report mentioned a limited life expectancy, but the legal process did not stop. Jury selection began on October 12th. On November 1st, after 11.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Marjorie guilty on all counts. And on February 28, 2011, the sentence was delivered. Life plus 30 years, with no chance of parole in the federal system. Throughout that long path, one question never truly went silent. Who really was Brian Wells in the middle of this vortex? For investigators, there were indications he knew about part of the plan, at least in the early stages. For his family, he was a victim who was trapped and manipulated. Someone who might have been convinced that the device around his neck was just a fake. Barnes insisted that Brian knew more than he let on. Brian's family insisted the opposite. Between those two opposing stances, the truth seemed to choose to reside in a gray area. But if we return to the most decisive time frame, between 1:30 and 3:18 on that day, the visible timeline is almost irrefutable. The instructions were real, but the time budget given to follow the route, find the clues, and unlock the collar was ultimately nonsensical. Even if everything had gone perfectly, the available minutes seemed insufficient. There was a clue that should have been in its place but had already been taken by someone else, as if a hand had deliberately erased the last chance. There was a man trying to follow the rules of a game, but the game, it seems, was never meant to be won. In the broader frame, prosecutors positioned Marjorie as the driving force of the plan, pushing those around her into action. Barnes as part of the logistics, who eventually cooperated with law enforcement, and Rothstein, already gone, as the behind-the-scenes figure believed to have the technical skills to create the deadly device. Floyd Stockton stood as the witness granted immunity, a crucial support for the narrative brought to the courtroom. One by one, the roles were assigned as far as they could be proven. The rest was left as the frayed edges of the story, edges that weren't entirely smooth but were enough to lead to a verdict. Finally, we returned to that hot parking lot on that sticky afternoon. There, a pizza delivery man sat with a fear that swallowed what little hope he had left. In his car, the instruction sheets fluttered lightly in the breeze, as if trying to hide the emptiness between their lines. In the distance, the sirens weren't fast enough to overtake fate. And within the police cordon, time, which had been promised as a way out, revealed its cruelest face. The name Brian Wells is often lost beneath terms like mastermind, collar bomb, and bizarre heist. Yet at the finish line, there was a human being behind that metal device, with a simple job, simple habits, and a simple hope of coming home in the evening. The city of Erie, initially just a helpless spectator, learned that ingenuity could be a mask for cruelty. that a meticulous plan could hide a dark void at its center, and that the truth sometimes arrives not as a sudden enlightenment, but as the courage to reread the script handed down by the perpetrators. From a brief bank robbery, from a parking lot that became a final stage, from instructions that promised safety but instead closed every door, this story concludes with a lesson that is not easily digested. Some games are created with no winners, and on that day in Erie, Pennsylvania, a man named Brian Wells was forced to play it until the very last second.